Hi everyone, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about the 1983 science fiction film Brainstorm. See the poster there with Christopher Walken on the cover there. Um, this film came out in 1983, put out by MGM. It was directed by Douglas Trumbull. The special effects master. He had directed one other film prior to this, Silent Running, in 1972, I believe, which I've talked about that film. But was a real innovator with special effects, working with Stanley Kubrick on 2001. He worked on Andromeda Strain, worked with Steven Spielberg on Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and Brainstorm was the second film Trumbull directed. The film starred Christopher Walken and Natalie Wood, Louise Fletcher, and some of the others Cliff Robertson in the film as well. So this film had a bit of a troubled production history, which I'll talk about towards the end. And the story was by Bruce Joel Rubin and written by Philip Frank Messina, and Robert Stitzel worked on the script. So what is Brainstorm about? Well, it is about technological advancement with some new age spirituality put into the story as well. So it's a movie about technology and what does technological advancement mean for spirituality. But it also gets into some other areas as well. More fundamentally, how do we interact with new technology, and how do we use new technology? So some really great questions are raised in the film, and Christopher Walken plays the lead scientist at this high-tech lab. Louise Fletcher plays a fellow scientist of his, and they're developing this sensory technology where you can record experiences, okay, and then you can put this headset on and actually experience the whole sensory side of it. So they will film, like if you're on a roller coaster, somebody will have this thing on their brain, as you see in the poster, and ride the roller coaster, or they'll be surfing waves or whatever, some kind of extreme sensory experience, which will be recorded into their brain, and then if someone else puts on the headset, they'll experience that same sensory experience. So it's kind of a far out idea. I guess it's virtual reality in some ways, where you are literally stepping into someone else's sensory experience is what's happening here. And I want to talk about how, because I think this technology never quite played out the way we thought it would, but I'll kind of get to that later. So so that's the basic idea of it, and there is also this idea as well. This film is similar, well, not similar, but on this almost parallel to something like Altered States, which is about isolation tanks and getting into the primal side of humanity and reverting back to early states of humanity and things like this in a kind of psychedelic experience. And Brainstorm also is trying to use technology to replicate what would be something like a psychedelic experience as well. So I'll kind of talk about that further a little bit. So in the film, they develop the technology, and the scenes in the lab are really interesting. We're seeing how they're developing the technology. It starts out with food, where somebody eats like a delicious meal, and then you can try on the headset, and you're like, you kind of experience like eating whatever the meal is, and they're really starting to perfect it. And there's Cliff Robertson plays a corporate guy who's also has connections to the government, kind of the military-industrial complex person, and they do a demonstration for Cliff Robertson, and he is just absolutely blown away by this technology, and he's like, I'm going to take this to my people, and I think he keeps. I'm trying to. I wrote down the quote he keeps using. Yeah, we've blown communication out of the water. Like this technology will bring about a communication revolution is the term he keeps saying in the film. But he also has connections to the government and the defense, as I said, the military industrial complex too. So they're also thinking about military applications of this technology as well. But at the same time, thinking about ways to market it and for it possibly to become like a consumer item, like the personal computer or video game systems or things like that. So, and it's interesting how the film develops that theme of how we use new technology and how is it used for profit or for other things. So the film does a good job of that. Also, we have, and there's also the idea too, which was interesting, where when they're first doing it, they have these gigantic headsets they're wearing, and they're like, well, who's going to buy one of these things? It's way too much, and they streamline it. It reminded me of Steve Jobs a little bit, where the whole idea of it's not just what the technology itself can do, but it's about the design of the technology. It has to be attractive. It has to be user friendly, and the film gets into that too, and how they are able to streamline the technology to make it workable. So as the story develops, there's conflicts where Louise Fletcher, especially, she's concerned about what is going to become of the technology. She's very idealistic and sees some really profound spiritual implications about this, and Christopher Walken feels the same way. And then the film in the middle kind of gets into focuses on the marriage between Walken and Natalie Wood, and how you can use this technology to relive memories as well. And we kind of see, I guess they've been married for some time, like 10 years or whatever, and we're getting different memories from their marriage, the highs and lows, their arguments, their moments when happy moments in their marriage. And there is an interesting interlude in the middle of the movie where we're seeing the power of memory. To relive things, you have photographs, and photographs are powerful for reliving memories, and you can watch videos as well, but this is where you actually can relive the memory, and the possibilities of that, of what that means for the human condition. So we get that romantic subplot in the middle, which works well. A lot of the movie was filmed around North Carolina, Kitty Hawk, where the Wright brothers had the famous flight with planes, and I guess the Walken character is really enthralled with the idea of flight and the Wright brothers, and that's where their lab is located. So there's that interesting side of it. And but as the plot develops in the middle, then where the military is very interested about what they can do with this, but they also learn about some of the drawbacks to using these sensory things. Like, for instance, it's also, the reverse side of this is putting traumatic memories on these things, and which can induce trauma in someone who would experience these horrible memories that someone could record. And we also have an interesting scene where one of the workers in the lab is given a sexual version of this, and he gets addicted to it, where he's able to inhabit someone else's body, and they're having sex, and he almost loses his mind, where he ends up kind of catatonic, and he almost dies because he becomes completely addicted to this technology, and just how the intense feelings it's giving him. So they're starting to have concerns about how this is going to affect the humans condition and things like that, and that does have some parallel to today, I think, with addictions to whatever it is involving technology, and how it can take over and consume someone's life, and not quite in the way we see in the film, where we don't have this technology yet that I know of, where you can actually, strap a band around your head and experience what someone else experienced, not just visually, but all senses involved. But that does hold some parallel to today. So they're starting to have some conflicts about what's going to be done with it. Meanwhile, the military, and they discover the military has all these plans where they can use it to interrogate people as a way of psychological warfare, is what the military is thinking about. And like, there's a very dark scene in the film where Walken gets wind of this, and he starts looking at what the military is doing. And there's one program where it can figure out what your worst fears are in your subconscious and put you in a situation where your worst fears come to life. So that's real horror movie type things. And at one point, Christopher Walken's son gets a hold of this headset, and it's one of these and he has this horrible vision of his parents like trying to kill him, and it's terrible. And he has a psychotic break. So once again, we're getting, the film does a good job of this, of showing the possible benefits of this, but how this can get really, really grim at the same time, and how we're going to use it. And in one scene, the key part of the movie as well, where Louise Fletcher's character, she has heart problems, and she has a fatal heart attack, and as she's experiencing this, she's recording the experience. She puts the headset on herself, and she's recording her own death, basically. So they are, and Walken becomes aware that you could actually experience, as he says, the worst fear that everyone has of dying, and to see what that's like. And a few people try it on, and it's way too powerful, and then eventually Walken does try this as well. And this is where the more, I think, psychedelic part of the movie comes into it, where we have the new age spirituality with visions of afterlife, with this being, technology being the way to this enlightenment, one might say. So a lot of interesting ideas in the film in that way. And I think, and back to what I've said about how we use technology. I mean, do we use it for profit? Do we use it for enlightenment, to make us better individuals? Do we use it strictly for recreation and for fun? These days that seems to be the focus, is just how can technology just lead us into escapism and fun and things like that? Or do we go really grim and nefarious, where what is like the way we could mobilize or militarize this technology and make it even more, and God knows what we could do. Once again, a parallel to, I guess, like Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project, where using quantum physics and all that to achieve some create some really terrible and destructive weapons. So I like how all those ideas are laid out in the film. So just a little thing about the production of the film, where there is a tragedy in this, where they were almost done filming. I believe part of it was filmed in North Carolina, and part was filmed at MGM Studios. And there was a break towards the end of filming, and Natalie Wood drowned when she was with her husband, and Christopher Walken was there, and the captain of the boat. And I mean, there's been so much written about this, but all we know is that she fell off the boat at some point. We don't know how it happened. There's various theories, and I'm really not an expert on this, but anyway, she passed away, and most of her scenes were completed. I believe they had to get her sister to double for some scenes. So there's this, and like there's still mysteries around what happened on the boat that night. And also MGM, after this happened, they quit production and were going to try to cut their losses and just end production on this movie completely. And Douglas Trumbull, to his credit, fought MGM. He took it to other studios. Other studios were interested in Brainstorm, and eventually it went back to MGM. Did have the film completed. I know some criticisms of the film get into the editing. The editing is a little jumbly, probably to, as I said, the tragedy that happened. And I think watching the film this time, I think it holds together well, but it is a little, sometimes we are getting a bit disjointed where we're jumping around to different stories at some points, but I think it holds together well. And like I said, I think the ideas in the film are interesting. Has a great score by James Horner, very familiar, if you're familiar with Horner's music for movies. Great. That, and the special effects are really good. I mean, there's the use of technology and some of the use of CGI and trying to make these visions come to life. So there's some interesting there as well. I know the speed at which it was filmed, the film speed. I know Trumbull was experimenting with that quite a bit. I'm not too good on the technical side of all this, but the idea was to make the more fantastical sequences more realistic than the real sequences. So there is an interesting visual style for the film, and probably watching Brainstorm on TV is not the best way to experience it. Probably it is in a big IMAX theater, which is the way it was intended for this movie to be experienced, and it is an experience. And so yeah, those are my thoughts on Brainstorm. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later.